Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to decode one of the most famous poems of the 20th century. And it turns out, for about 100 years, it's been hiding this huge secret, the story of a pandemic that the world basically forgot.
All right, so let's just dive right in with the big question for today's whole explainer. I mean, think about it for a second. We build these massive, incredible memorials for wars and soldiers, but where are the memorials for the pandemics that killed even more people? It really gets you thinking about what we, as a society, decide is worth remembering, and maybe more importantly, what we decide to just forget. Okay, so let's start here. We're basically looking at a historical crime scene. You've got this global catastrophe that infected, get this, a third of the world's population. And then, poof, it's almost completely wiped from our cultural memory. How in the world does something that huge just disappear? 50 million. And that's the conservative estimate of how many people the 1918 Spanish flu killed. To put that into perspective for you, that is more than double the number of people, we're talking soldiers and civilians combined, who died in World War I. And yet, one of those events is in all our history books, and the other, it's usually just a footnote. It's wild.
And this really gets to the psychology of it all, you know? Why we have this kind of collective amnesia. A war, even a horrible one, can be spun into a story of noble collective sacrifice, right? Soldiers fighting for their country. But a pandemic? That's a lonely fight. It's an individual battle fought in a sickbed. There's no hero story there, just a quiet, private tragedy happening millions and millions of times over. It's just so much harder to build a shared story around that kind of loss.
Which brings us to our main piece of evidence, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. It came out in 1922, and it's this absolute masterpiece of modernism. You know the type. It's dense, it's fragmented, it's famously difficult to read, but it was seen as the perfect piece of art for a world that felt completely broken.
Now, for 100 years, there's been sort of an official story about what the wasteland is all about. It's probably the version you learned in English class, and surprise, surprise, it has pretty much nothing to do with a virus.
Yeah, for decades, the experts have said the poem is all about the trauma of World War I. Or it's about the cultural and spiritual collapse of Europe. Or maybe it's about Eliot's own messy marriage and his mental health struggles. Or it's this deep dive into ancient myths. And look, all of those interpretations are totally valid. But are they the whole story?
What's really interesting is that Eliot himself pushed back on all the high-minded interpretations. He famously just dismissed the whole thing as a personal and wholly insignificant grouse against life. Just him complaining, basically. But what if that personal grouse, that complaint, was shaped by something so huge, so all-encompassing, that it was literally the air he was breathing? And this is where things get really interesting. A new theory has emerged thanks to a scholar named Elizabeth Outka, and she argues that for a solid century, we've all been missing the poem's viral context, something that was hidden in plain sight the entire time. Just take a look at this timeline. It's pretty stark. The end of World War I, the absolute deadliest waves of the Spanish flu, and the exact time T.S. Eliot was dreaming up the wasteland, they're all happening at the exact same time. It's a huge convergence. So he wasn't just living in a post-war world, he was living in a post-pandemic world too. And here we go. This is kind of the smoking gun, pulled straight from Eliot's own letters. In December 1918, both he and his wife, Vivian, got the flu, and he called it a long epidemic of domestic influenza. See what he did there? He blurred the line between his own physical sickness and the sickness in his marriage. So the virus wasn't just some abstract thing happening out there in the world. It was inside his house. It was inside him.
Okay, so with this new piece of evidence in our back pocket, let's go back to the poem itself. Let's try putting on our pandemic glasses, so to speak. Do those famously impossible lines suddenly start to make a whole lot more sense?
First things first, we need to get our heads around this one medical term, delirium. It's not just about being confused. It's a total breakdown of reality. And it's caused by a body fighting a really high fever. It's literally the feeling of being trapped inside a fever dream.
And this is the master key. The Wasteland is famous for how it just jumps around, right? All these different scenes, characters, voices. It feels totally chaotic and disconnected. But what if it's not chaos? What if it's the logic of delirium? The poem isn't just describing a pandemic. Its entire structure is built to feel like the disorienting, hallucinatory nightmare of a body burning up with fever.
So when you look at it through this pandemic lens, those super famous opening lines, they become unbelievably chilling. One critic even suggests that maybe this is the voice of a corpse buried in a mass grave. From that perspective, spring isn't about rebirth. It's a cruel, painful disturbance, a reminder of a life you don't get to live anymore. And then there's this overwhelming, desperate thirst all through the poem. For years, people said, oh, that's spiritual thirst. But it's also a literal symptom. Eliot himself wrote in a letter that the flu caused extreme dryness. The poem's dry, cracked landscape perfectly mirrors that physical feeling of dehydration, that burning fever that millions of people would have known all too well.
The poem is also full of the sound of bells, and you have to remember, in 1918, church bells were ringing constantly for all the people who died from the flu. For us, the modern version of that sound was probably the constant, unnerving sound of ambulance sirens during the worst of COVID-19. It's that background noise of crisis that just gets into everything.
Look, rereading a 100-year-old poem like this isn't just some dusty academic exercise. It actually forces us to turn around and look at our own recent past and ask some really tough questions about how we're going to choose to remember.
Because 100 years after the wasteland, here we are, facing the exact same challenge. How do you create a lasting, shared memory for a global tragedy that for so many of us was such a lonely and isolating experience?
And you can already see a battle for that memory starting to happen. On one side, you've got the official records, the government statements that might try to downplay how bad things were. And on the other side, you have the raw, documented truth that we saw from photojournalists. Pictures showing the real scale of the tragedy in our hospitals and funeral homes. So maybe the memory of the 1918 pandemic wasn't ever really erased. Maybe it was just hidden, encoded into the very DNA of art, just waiting for a future generation, our generation, who just lived through our own pandemic to finally have the key to unlock it. And that really leaves us with one last big thought. 100 years from now, when historians want to understand what the COVID-19 pandemic really felt like, where are they going to look? Are they going to read the official government reports? Or are they going to have to search for that fever dream logic in our art, our music, and our poetry to find the story that we just couldn't tell any other way?